Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager. Tonight we're doing something absolutely unhinged. We are climbing inside one of the most dramatic underdog stories in all of human history. The year is 1552. The place is a mid-sized Hungarian fortress town called Eger, and the situation is, to put it gently, not great. Imagine showing up to your Tuesday morning commute and discovering that roughly 150,000 soldiers of the most powerful empire in the known world have decided that your entire commute, is their next target. That is what's happening tonight. 2,000 Hungarians, give or take a few guys who probably called in sick that morning, are staring down the full military might of the Ottoman Empire. No backup, no cavalry arriving over the hill, no dramatic last-minute peace treaty, just walls, grit, and a truly unhealthy amount of stubbornness. So before we go any further, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. It costs you nothing, and it means the world. If someone suggested tonight's topic in the comments, thank you. Genuinely, I read them, I love them. You're the reason we sail. Now dim those lights, turn on a fan, pull your blanket all the way up, and get comfortable, because we are going in. Let's pause for a second though. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be inside those walls? Did the defenders of Eger eat breakfast the morning the siege began, or did someone forget to do the shopping? What did you wear to a siege? Was there a uniform, or did you just show up in whatever you had? Did people crack jokes to cope? Or was it 40 days of pure existential dread? What did it smell like inside a fortress packed with 2,000 people, burning wood, boiling oil, and the collective anxiety of an entire civilization? Could you sleep? Could you eat? Could you look over the wall and count the enemy campfires without immediately reconsidering your life choices? And now, congratulations. You have just woken up inside the walls of Eger Castle. The date is the 11th of September, 1552. Outside, the horizon is dark with tents, siege engines, and approximately 150,000 reasons to be very, very awake. You have a sword, a rumbling stomach, a captain who seems disturbingly calm, and absolutely nowhere to run. Good morning. Let's talk about where Hungary was sitting in 1552, because geography, as it turns out, is destiny, and Hungary had been handed the worst possible geography at the worst possible moment. You're born into a kingdom that is, technically speaking, still a kingdom, but only in the way that a house with no roof, 3 walls, and a very aggressive neighbour is technically still a house. The Ottoman Empire has already swallowed the southern 2/3 of Hungary after the catastrophic Battle of Mohács in 1526, a battle so one-sided it still makes Hungarian historians need to sit down for a moment. What's left is a rump state, a thin strip of land along the northern and western edges, clinging to its identity the way you cling to your last 5% battery on a long drive. This is the world you are born into. A world where the empire knocking at the door is not metaphorical. It has already walked through half the house, and it is hungry for the rest. To understand the full weight of that, you need to understand what Mohács actually was. In 1526, the Hungarian army, cavalry heavy, proud, and fatally overconfident, rode out to meet the Ottoman forces of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in open battle. The engagement lasted roughly 2 hours. The Hungarian army ceased to exist as a functional military force in roughly 2 hours. King Louis II of Hungary died fleeing the battlefield, thrown from his horse into a stream and drowned, which is the kind of death that history writes down with a certain uncomfortable quiet. A kingdom that had existed for 500 years lost its spine in an afternoon. And what came after was not recovery so much as managed decline with occasional moments of stubborn resistance. By the time you're standing in Eger in 1552, Hungary is divided into 3 pieces. The Ottomans hold the centre and the south, the Great Plains, the old capital of Buda, the heartland. The Habsburgs, the Austrian dynasty that has picked up the Hungarian crown, control the western and northern edges, and Transylvania in the east exists as a semi-independent principality, paying tribute to the Ottomans and trying very hard not to attract attention. You live in a country that is simultaneously occupied, contested, and theoretically sovereign, which is the kind of administrative situation that would make a modern constitutional lawyer weep openly. The northern stretch of Hungary where Eger sits is the front line. It is the zone between the Ottoman-held plains and the Habsburg-controlled highlands, and it looks exactly like what it is, a border region that has been fought over repeatedly and expects to be fought over again. The fortresses along this line are not decorative. They are load-bearing. Each one is a node in a defensive network designed to slow an Ottoman advance long enough for reinforcements to arrive, except that the reinforcements, as Eger is about to discover, are not always coming. Eger itself is a town of modest size in the valley of a small river, surrounded by gentle hills that would be absolutely beautiful in peacetime, and are in 1552 primarily useful as elevated positions from which an attacker can observe your walls. The castle sits on a ridge above the town. It is not enormous, it is not cutting edge, but it is there, and it is yours, and the man in charge of it has spent several years quietly making it as difficult to take as he possibly can with the resources available, which brings us to him. Because no discussion of Eger makes sense without first understanding the particular human being who decided, against all reasonable advice from basic arithmetic, that this was a fight worth having. Let's talk about the man in charge of this whole operation, because understanding the Siege of Eger means understanding István Dobó, and understanding Dobó means accepting that some people are simply wired differently from the rest of us. Dobó is the captain of Eger Castle. He is not young, not naive, and absolutely not the kind of man who reads a report saying 150,000 Ottoman soldiers are marching toward his fortress and thinks, well, perhaps they're just passing through. Dobó is a nobleman, a soldier, a military administrator, and, crucially, a man who has spent years quietly reinforcing Eger's walls, training its garrison, and stockpiling supplies, as if he knew exactly what was coming, because he did. In an era when the standard response to an unstoppable Ottoman advance was to retreat, negotiate, or both at once, Dobó made a different calculation entirely. He stayed, and then he made everyone else stay too. Dobó had been appointed captain of Eger in 1549, 3 years before the siege. This was not a ceremonial appointment. The Habsburgs gave him the job because they needed someone who would actually do it, and doing it meant managing a border fortress that sat directly in the path of Ottoman expansion, with the awareness that it was going to be tested. Dobó took the job the way a surgeon takes a difficult case, not because it was safe, but because he had the skills and someone had to do it. In those 3 years, he didn't relax. He repaired walls, he built new bastions, he brought in artillery and made sure the gunners knew how to use it. He recruited soldiers and, equally importantly, paid them on time, which in the 16th century was not as standard a practice as you might hope. He pre-positioned food, water and ammunition in quantities designed to outlast a sustained siege. He drilled the garrison. He assessed the weak points in the fortifications and addressed them one by one, with the focused patience of a man who is quietly certain that the exam is coming and intends to be ready for it. He was also a man who understood people, which is a different skill from military logistics, and equally essential. He knew that a castle is not just walls and cannons, it is the people inside those walls, and those people need to believe that the walls will hold, and that belief needs to come from somewhere. In Dobó's case, it came from him. He was not a man given to dramatic speeches about glory, or rather, if he gave such speeches, They were backed by the visible evidence that he had actually prepared for this moment, which made them considerably more convincing than speeches usually are. When the Ottoman army arrived in September of 1552, Dobó's preparation became visible in a way it had not been before. The walls were in better shape than they should have been. The garrison was better trained than you would expect for a border fortress of this size. The supplies were there, the guns were loaded, and the captain was on the wall, calm in the particular way that people who have done their preparation can be calm, not because they are unafraid, but because they have already done everything that fear would tell them to do, and now they are simply waiting to see if it was enough. That calm was, in its own way, the most important thing inside those walls. You cannot manufacture it. You either did the work, or you didn't. Dobó had done the work, and every soldier looking at him could see it. Now let's get into the castle itself, because Eger Castle in 1552 was, to put it diplomatically, not exactly the Helm's Deep of Central Europe. It was a real medieval fortress, old walls, some towers, a cathedral that had been converted into a military building, but it was not a purpose-built military superstructure. It was the kind of castle that a medieval architect would describe as adequate, and a modern structural engineer would describe as concerning. The walls had been improved, yes. Dobó had done his best. But the basic reality was that this was a regional Hungarian fortress facing the full siege apparatus of the Ottoman Empire, an empire that had at this point successfully cracked open significantly more impressive fortifications than this one. The math made no sense. The walls were too few, the men were too few, the cannons were too few. And yet, and this is the part that keeps historians up at night, those walls held. The castle occupied a ridge above the town of Eger, which gave it the natural defensive advantage of elevation. Any attacker approaching the walls was doing so from below, which is never the preferred direction of travel when people above you are dropping things. The ridge was not dramatically steep. This was not a cliff-top fortress, but it was enough to make a direct assault physically harder and to give the defenders a clear line of sight over the surrounding terrain. You could see trouble coming, which at least allowed you to be stressed about it in advance rather than surprised. The walls themselves were a mixture of stone construction from different periods, which is the polite way of saying that some of them were older and less reliable than others. Dobó's renovations had focused on the most vulnerable sections, the points where the ground outside was level enough to allow for close approach, or where earlier construction had left gaps in the defensive line. He had added earth ramparts behind some sections of stone wall, which was a technique that was becoming increasingly important in the age of artillery. A stone wall, however thick, shatters when hit repeatedly by heavy cannonballs. Earth absorbs the impact differently, it compresses, it shifts, but it does not explode outward into lethal fragments the way masonry does. The castle had several distinct sections with their own gates and internal barriers, which meant that even if an attacker breached the outer wall, they were not immediately inside the whole fortress. They were inside a section of it, which still had to be taken section by section, each one a new problem to solve, this kind of layered. Defence is the difference between a fortress that falls in an afternoon and one that ties up an army for 5 weeks. There were towers at intervals along the wall, higher than the curtain wall itself, which allowed defenders to fire along the face of the wall, an angle called flanking fire, against attackers who had reached the base. This is one of those architectural features that sounds dry on paper, and is in practice the difference between living and not living, because the base of the wall is where ladders go up and where miners dig down, and the ability to shoot at people attempting either of those activities is obviously desirable. Was it a great fortress? No. Was it good enough, in the hands of the right people, doing the right things, at enormous personal cost, to turn back an army that should have eaten it alive in a week? Apparently, yes. Which says something about fortresses, and something about people, and something about the gap between what the numbers say should happen and what actually does. Here is a number for you: 2,100. That is roughly how many defenders Eger had when the Ottoman army arrived. Soldiers, gunners, cavalry, and a small number of women and servants who would shortly prove to be considerably more involved in the fighting than anyone had originally planned. Now here is another number. 100,000, give or take, is the lower estimate for the Ottoman force. Some sources push the number closer to 150,000. You do not need to be a military strategist to understand the problem here. You just need to be able to count. The ratio of attackers to defenders was somewhere between 40 and 70 to 1, depending on whose account you read. For context, military doctrine generally considers a 3-to-1 advantage sufficient for a successful assault. The Ottomans had roughly 15 times that. This is the kind of odds that make people write wills, say meaningful things to their loved ones, and quietly consider whether the back gate is unlocked. But numbers are only part of the story, because numbers count bodies, and bodies are not all that defenders have. What Eger's garrison had, in addition to their 2,000 warm and increasingly anxious people, was position. Position matters enormously in siege warfare, because the mathematics of attack and defence are not symmetric. A defender firing from behind a wall at an attacker who is in the open is in a fundamentally different situation from two armies of equal size meeting in a field. The wall is doing work. Every metre of stone between you and the incoming fire is doing work that a human body would otherwise have to do, and human bodies are much less good at stopping cannonballs than stone walls are, usually. The garrison was not a random collection of people who happened to be inside the castle when the Ottomans arrived. Dobó had spent 3 years building this force deliberately, recruiting professional soldiers and training them to know the castle the way you know your own house, which corner squeaks, which wall is weakest, where the ammunition is stored, what to do when a breach opens and there are 10 seconds to respond. This familiarity was a significant tactical advantage in a fight that was going to be conducted largely in close quarters, in corridors and on narrow battlements where intimate knowledge of the terrain was worth more than abstract military training. There were cavalry among the defenders, which might seem like a strange thing to have inside a besieged castle, where there is nowhere to ride. But cavalry were not just horsemen. They were trained fighters with specific skills, and in a siege they dismounted and fought on the walls like everyone else, but with the physical conditioning, weapons training, and psychological temperament that cavalry service tended to produce. They were, in essence, an upgrade to the infantry pool that happened to have horses taking up stable space. The garrison also included a number of skilled gunners, men who knew how to load, aim, and fire the castle's cannon with accuracy. These were specialists in an era when artillery was still new enough to be complicated, and their presence multiplied the effective firepower of the defence in ways that raw numbers could not capture. 2,000 men with accurate artillery covering every approach to the walls was a very different proposition from 2,000 men with nothing but cold steel and good intentions. Still, 100,000 to 2,000. You can optimise all you like, and the math still stares back at you with a certain bleak confidence. The defenders of Eger looked at that math every single morning for 38 days and chose to disagree with it. That is, historically speaking, a remarkable thing to do. Let's talk about what 200 plus years of Ottoman military evolution looks like when it shows up outside your front door, because the army that arrived at Eger in 1552 was not just big. It was the most sophisticated land military force on the planet at that time, and it had brought everything. The campaign was commanded by Kara Ahmed Pasha, a Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, and he came prepared for a siege the way you might prepare for a camping trip if you were a superpower with a professional logistics corps. There were cannons, large, medium and small, brought over mountain roads by oxen teams whose job was both thankless and genuinely essential. There were thousands of janissaries, the elite infantry of the Ottoman army, professional soldiers trained from childhood who are widely considered the finest foot soldiers in the world. There were engineers, miners, sappers and siege specialists, and there were tents. So many tents. The plain around Eger Castle went from empty farmland to the largest city in the region almost overnight, and none of the locals had been consulted about this. The Ottoman army of this period was not just large, it was organised. It had a supply system, a command hierarchy, specialist units for every phase of siege warfare, and a collective institutional knowledge accumulated from decades of successful campaigns against fortifications across 3 continents. They had taken Belgrade, they had taken Rhodes, they had besieged Vienna itself in 1529, and while they had not taken Vienna, they had come close enough to leave a lasting impression on everyone who had been watching. These were not people who were learning how sieges worked. These were people who had largely written the manual. The artillery train was the most visible symbol of this accumulated power. Moving large cannons in the 16th century was a logistical undertaking of staggering complexity. The largest siege guns weighed several tons, required teams of oxen to pull, and turned roads into ruts and bridges into engineering challenges. The Ottoman Empire had invested heavily in exactly this capability, building cannons and training the crews to use them over decades of sustained military investment. By 1552, their siege artillery was the best in the world, and they had brought a significant portion of it to Eger. The Janissaries deserved their own moment of respect because they were genuinely extraordinary soldiers by any standard of their era. The Janissary Corps was an elite infantry force recruited through a system called Devshirm. Boys taken as tribute from Christian families in the Balkans, raised in Ottoman households, educated, trained, and eventually inducted into the corps as professional soldiers with no other identity or loyalty. They were disciplined, well-equipped, and experienced in the kind of assault warfare that sieges required. Facing Janissaries on a breach in your wall was not a fair fight. It was never meant to be. And beyond the Janissaries and the artillery, there were the irregular cavalry, the siege, engineers, the supply trains, the medical corps, the administrative staff, the full apparatus of an empire conducting military operations at scale. Standing on the walls of Eger and watching this army settle into camp around you must have produced a feeling that had no good name, something past fear and past awe, arriving somewhere in the neighbourhood of a very quiet, very clear understanding that the situation was serious. Dobó reportedly walked the walls that first evening and said nothing remarkable, which was, under the circumstances, the most remarkable thing he could have done. The 11th of September, 1552. That is the day it starts, and if you're inside Eger Castle on that morning, the experience is roughly this. You wake up, you walk to the wall, you look out, and what you see rewires something fundamental in your brain. The Ottoman camp stretches across the valley like a city that appeared overnight. The fires alone, cooking fires, heating fires, signal. Fires are so numerous that in the early morning fog they look like a second sky of low orange stars. The sound reaches you before anything else, the low rumble of tens of thousands of men, animals and machines settling into position, a sound that has no modern equivalent unless you have ever stood next to a highway overpass during rush hour and multiplied it by 10,000. For the defenders of Eger, this is not a surprise. They have been told the army's coming, but there is a significant difference between being told an enormous army is coming and standing on a wall looking at it. Your legs understand that difference before your brain does. The first days of a siege were, historically, not always characterised by immediate violence. There was a protocol, a sequence of moves that both sides understood. The besieging force had to establish its camp, position its artillery, and survey the fortifications before committing to a bombardment or assault. This was not courtesy, it was practical necessity. You did not fire your expensive cannons at a wall until you had figured out which sections were weakest, and where the fire would do the most work. This gave the defenders a few days of relative quiet. Relative being a word that deserves some emphasis, because watching an army of 100,000 people set up camp around you is not emotionally quiet, even if it is temporarily quiet in the artillery sense. Inside the castle, these first days were a period of final preparation. Anything that had not yet been done was done now. Ammunition was distributed to the walls and towers. The hospital area, such as it was organised and supplied. Water cisterns were checked and filled. The rationing system that would govern food distribution for the weeks ahead was put in place. Every person inside those walls was given a role and a position, a section of wall or a specific task, so that when the first cannon fired, nobody had to figure out where they were, supposed to be. Dobó made his rounds. He talked to the soldiers at their posts, not in the way a man talks when he is performing confidence, but in the way a man talks when he is checking in, looking at faces, asking questions, noting who was steady and who needed steadying. This kind of leadership is invisible in most historical accounts, because it does not produce dramatic quotable moments. But it was real, and it mattered, and the men who experienced it remembered it decades later when they gave testimony about the siege. The first Ottoman cannon fired on the 12th of September. The sound of it rolled across the valley and hit the castle walls, and then hit the people on those walls in the chest in that physical way that very loud sounds do. And then the defenders of Eger picked up their weapons, took their positions, and the siege of 1552 began in earnest. Nobody inside those walls was under any illusion about what was coming. They just had to decide one more time that they were staying anyway. That decision, remade every morning for 38 days, is the real story of Eger. Within the first hours of the siege, Dobó does something that will define the entire defence. He makes it perfectly, uncomfortably clear that leaving is not an option. This is not a speech filled with pretty words about glory and honour, though there may have been some of those too, because this is the 16th century, and people were significantly more into dramatic speeches than we are today. This is a practical military decision. Dobó understands that the single greatest threat to the defence of Eger is not the Ottoman cannons. It is the moment when one man decides the math does not work and tries to slip out the back, and then another man sees him go, and then the idea spreads the way bad ideas always spread in enclosed, stressed spaces, rapidly and without resistance. So Dobó draws a line. You signed up for this. You are staying for this. The walls will hold or they will not, but they will hold with everyone inside them, because a fortress with 2,000 people in it is a fortress, and a fortress with 1,980 people in it is a building with an anxiety problem. The historical record indicates that there were in fact attempts to desert in the early days of the siege. This is not surprising. Desertion is the rational response to a situation where the alternative is staying inside a castle that an enormous army is systematically trying to destroy. The human brain is quite good at identifying exits and quite creative about justifying their use. But Dobó had anticipated this, as he had anticipated most things, and his response to it was swift and unambiguous. Deserters were treated not as frightened individuals making understandable choices, but as people actively undermining the only strategy that gave anyone a chance of surviving. The distinction mattered. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was the maintenance of a collective decision that had to remain collective to function. But punishment alone does not keep people on a wall. Fear of punishment keeps people in camp, which is different. What keeps people on a wall, what keeps people fighting, days into a siege when the novelty is worn off and the exhaustion has set in, and the Ottomans are still there and the wall they repaired yesterday got hit again this morning, is something that has to be generated from inside the group, not imposed from outside it. And this is where Dobó's leadership style becomes genuinely interesting. He shared the hardship visibly. He slept in the castle with his men. He ate the same food. He appeared on the wall during bombardments when he could have been in the safer interior buildings, not because his presence was militarily necessary at every moment, but because his presence said something about the nature of this shared situation that words could not say as efficiently. We are all here. We are all in this. There is no version of this where some people are safe and others are not. He also managed information carefully. Not by lying. The defenders could see the Ottoman camp. They were not being fooled about the scale of what they faced, but by framing. When a section of wall was damaged, the emphasis was on repair, not on loss. When an assault was repelled, it was a victory, even a small one. The accumulation of small victories was the narrative that Dobó was building day by day, because human beings in crisis need a narrative to inhabit, and the narrative he was constructing was, we have done this before, we can do it again, and we are still here. And every morning they still were. The Ottoman cannons open up within days of the army's arrival, and when they do, the sensation inside the castle walls is, there is really no good modern equivalent here, except perhaps if someone parked a construction demolition crew directly outside your bedroom and began operating at full capacity forever. The largest Ottoman cannons of this era fired stone or iron balls weighing between 15 and 30 kilograms, and they fired them repeatedly, all day, sometimes all night, aimed at the same spots on the wall with a patience and precision that siege engineers had spent generations perfecting. The walls of Eger were thick, but thick has a limit. Sections began to crack, towers began to lean. Whole segments of parapet crumbled into rubble that had to be cleared by hand by exhausted defenders who then had to pile up earth and timber in its place before the next morning's bombardment found the gap. It is worth pausing here to appreciate the absolute psychological weight of this, not just surviving the cannonballs, but then having to go fix the wall they hit before sunrise. Artillery in the 16th century was not precise in the modern sense of the word. There was no computerized targeting, no laser range finding, no GPS. A cannon crew aimed by eye, adjusted by experience, and corrected by observation of where the last shot landed. But what it lacked in precision, it more than compensated for in persistence. A large siege cannon could fire perhaps 10 to 15 times per hour, and the Ottomans had many of them, and they fired them every day. And the cumulative effect of that sustained impact on stone walls was not subtle. It was geological. The walls of Eger were being worn down the way coastlines are worn down, not in a single dramatic moment, but by the relentless application of force over time. The sound alone was its own weapon. You could be nowhere near the impact point and still feel a heavy cannonball hit the wall through the stone under your feet. The vibration travelled through the masonry the way sound travels through water, in every direction at once. Men stationed at other parts of the wall would feel the hit, wait a heartbeat, and then hear the crash, and then have to resist the entirely reasonable impulse to go see what had just happened. Staying at your post when a section of wall 200 metres away had just been hit required a specific quality of self-discipline that the drill of the previous 3 years was designed to produce. The defenders fired back. Eger had its own artillery, smaller and fewer than the Ottoman guns, but positioned with the enormous advantage of pre-registered targets. Every Ottoman approach route, every likely battery position, every stretch of ground that an assault force would have to cross had been measured and recorded before the siege began. The castle's gunners knew exactly how to adjust their aim, because they had done the calculation in advance, which gave them an accuracy that partly compensated for the difference in firepower. They could not match the Ottoman bombardment in volume. They could, and did, make it expensive to maintain. The nights brought repair. Every evening after the day's bombardment slowed, crews of soldiers and civilians would move to the damaged. Sections of wall with timber, earth, and whatever stone could be salvaged from the rubble, and they would build. They were not rebuilding what had been destroyed. That was beyond their resources. They were maintaining the minimum defensive structure necessary to survive the next day's bombardment, which is a different and more modest goal, but it was the goal that mattered. They met it, day after day for 38 days. When the sun came up, the walls were still there, not intact, not what they had been. But there, and occupied, and defended. That was enough. Here is the part of the Siege of Eger that you will not find in most general history summaries, and which the people of Hungary have remembered with enormous pride for nearly 500 years. The women inside that castle fought. They did not fight because they were ordered to, or because someone handed them a weapon and said, "This is your job now." They fought because the walls were being breached, the men were exhausted, and the alternative was to stand back and watch. They carried stones to the battlements to drop on Ottoman soldiers attempting to scale the walls. They poured boiling water and burning ash down onto attackers who had reached the base of the walls. They brought ammunition to the gunners. They dragged the wounded away from the fighting. Some accounts describe them in direct combat, pushing back Ottoman soldiers who had breached a section of wall, in an era that had very specific and rigid ideas about what women were supposed to do during military campaigns, which was essentially not this. The women of Eger simply ignored those ideas entirely and got to work. The historical sources on the women of Eger are real, if frustratingly sparse in their individual details. We have names. Cecilia Varkocsi, the wife of one of the officers, appears in the record. The novel by Gardoni, written 3 centuries later, elevated these women into prominent characters, and while historical fiction and historical fact require careful separation, the core truth that women participated actively in the defence of Eger is not Gardoni's invention. It is documented in contemporaneous accounts. What they were doing when they poured boiling liquid down onto attackers or dropped stones from the battlements was participating in one of the oldest forms of castle defence, the active use of height and gravity against anyone foolish enough to be at the base of your wall. This required no special training in weapons. It required presence, determination, and the willingness to be on the wall during an active assault, which was not a safe place to be. The Ottomans were shooting back. The wall was being hit by artillery. The air on the battlements during a major assault was not empty. It was full of arrows, musket balls, and the kind of general chaos that makes staying in place a non-trivial act of will. The contribution of the women of Eger was not symbolic, it was material. In a garrison of 2,000 people defending a perimeter that stretched across hundreds of metres of wall, every able body that could carry a stone, pour a pot, or drag a wounded man away from a breach was adding to the defensive capacity of the castle in a concrete, measurable way. A wall section that was being actively defended from above was harder to breach. An assault that lost men to boiling water and falling stones was an assault that cost the attackers more than they had budgeted for. These are not emotional assessments, they're tactical ones. And there was a secondary effect that may have been just as important. The presence of women on the walls meant something to the men fighting beside them. Not in a chivalric, protective sense, there was no time for that, but in a more fundamental one. When the people who are not supposed to fight decide to fight anyway, it communicates something to everyone watching about the nature of the shared stakes. It says without words that everyone inside these walls understands what losing means, and everyone has decided that losing is not acceptable. That collective declaration, made visible in the most direct way possible, had a morale effect that no speech could have matched. The women of Eger didn't save the castle by themselves, but they were part of what saved it, and they knew it, and the castle knew it too. At some point, around day 4 or 5 of an active siege, with cannon fire rearranging the architecture around you on a daily basis, your body sends you a message that is completely out of step with the drama of the situation. It says, "I am hungry. Feed me." And the reality of food inside a besieged 16th century fortress is one of the great overlooked themes of military history, because the food situation during a siege was always a negotiation between what you brought in, what you had time to grow or hunt, and how long you needed to make it last. Dobó had pre-positioned supplies before the siege, began salt meat, grain, dried legumes, whatever could be stored without spoiling, because he was, as we have established, not the kind of man who waits for problems to arrive before thinking about them. But stored food for 2,000 people over an extended period is a math problem that gets more complicated every day, and the defenders of Eger were solving it in real time, under bombardment, while also trying not to die. The staple food of a 16th century Hungarian garrison would have been bread or flatbread made from stored grain, supplemented by dried or salted meat, preserved vegetables, legumes, and whatever could be supplemented from the castle's own resources. Eger Castle had wells, which meant water was not an immediate crisis, a crucial advantage, because sieges were frequently decided not by assault, but by the simple elimination of the defender's water supply. As long as the wells held, dehydration was not the enemy. Starvation was the longer-term concern, and Dobó's pre-positioning bought the garrison the time it needed to outlast the siege before that concern became critical. Eating during a siege has a quality that eating at other times does not. Every meal is rationed, which means every meal is also a calculation. How much is left? How long will it need to last? How do you divide what you have among 2,000 people without creating the kind of resentment that undermines the collective will to keep fighting? The quartermaster's role in a military garrison was, among other things, exactly this: the management of scarcity in a way that felt fair, because fairness under pressure is the social glue that holds a defending force together. You can tolerate a small portion if you believe everyone else is getting the same small portion. You cannot tolerate it if you suspect the officers are eating better while you're eating less, which is the kind of grievance that, in a besieged castle with swords everywhere, tends to resolve itself messily. Wine appears in the historical record as part of the garrison's supplies. This was standard practice in the era, when wine was both a nutritional supplement and a water substitute in situations where the water quality was unreliable. It was not consumed for pleasure in the modern recreational sense, or not only for that, but as a functional part of the diet, providing calories and reducing the risk of waterborne illness. Dobó reportedly managed the wine ration carefully, issuing it in measured amounts, sufficient to maintain morale without impairing the fighting capacity of a garrison that could not afford to be impaired at any moment. The food you ate in Eger Castle in the autumn of 1552 was not good food in the culinary sense. It was adequate food, managed to remain adequate for as long as the siege lasted, which turned out to be long enough. By the time the Ottomans withdrew in October, the garrison's supplies were significantly reduced but not exhausted. Dobó had calculated correctly, as he had calculated most things correctly. You were hungry most of the time, but you were still standing, which was, in the circumstances, the only thing that actually mattered. Let us discuss sleep, because sleep during a siege is its own special category of human experience, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets in the historical record. You are inside a stone castle. The walls are several feet thick, which is reassuring from a structural standpoint until a cannonball finds one of them and reminds you that all thickness has a limit. You sleep on straw, on wooden boards, on whatever surface is available in whatever room has not recently been damaged. The watch rotation means that you're sleeping in shifts, a few hours on, a few hours off, and your body never quite accepts this arrangement, which means that the accumulated sleep debt of the garrison after 2 or 3 weeks is staggering. Men are fighting on 4 hours of broken sleep, or 3 hours, or less, and they are fighting with swords and spears at close quarters on crumbling battlements, which is a combination that requires a level of human endurance that most modern people will never have cause to discover. The watch system inside a besieged castle was not identical to the naval watch system on a pirate ship, but it operated on similar logic. The perimeter had to be observed at all times. The moment a section of wall was left unobserved was the moment an enterprising Ottoman soldier tested it, and the moment an unobserved section was tested was potentially the moment the castle fell. So the garrison rotated, men on the wall, men resting, men eating, men repairing, in a cycle that never fully stopped, because the siege never fully stopped. Even in the quieter hours of the early morning when the bombardment had slowed and the assault parties had pulled back, the walls had to be manned. Not because an attack was likely at 3 a.m, but because the cost of being wrong was the kind of cost you only paid once. Your sleeping space inside Eger Castle was wherever you could find a horizontal surface that was not directly exposed to incoming fire. The interior rooms of the castle's buildings offered the most shelter from artillery, and these spaces would have been densely occupied. Men sleeping on straw pallets, on cloaks spread over stone floors, on whatever padding could be improvised from available material. The smell of a room full of exhausted soldiers who have been fighting all day in the 16th century is not something any historical account dwells on at length, but it was very much a real feature of the experience. You did not sleep in comfort. You slept in proximity to approximately 100 other people who were also trying to sleep, and you slept as quickly and as deeply as your body allowed, because in a few hours you would be back on the wall. Stone castles are also cold. September in the Sega Valley of northern Hungary is not summer. The evenings cool quickly, and by October the nights are genuinely cold. The stone walls of the castle absorbed and radiated that cold in a way that sleeping against them made unmistakably clear. Fires were maintained where possible, but fuel management in a siege was its own calculation, and warmth was a rationed resource like everything else. You slept in your clothes. You pulled whatever covering you had over yourself. You shared body heat with the men sleeping beside you, with the pragmatic, unsentimental closeness of people who are past caring about personal space. And then the cannon fired again, or the alarm went up, or the man next to you shook you awake, and you were back on the wall before you had fully processed the transition from asleep to awake. This happened every day, for 38 days. The human body adapts to almost anything, which is both its greatest strength and the thing that allowed the defenders of Eger to keep functioning, long past the point where functioning should have been possible. You did not sleep well at Eger in the autumn of 1552, but you slept in the cracks between the crises, and that was enough to keep you upright the next morning. Just barely, but enough. One of the least glamorous and most terrifying aspects of medieval and Renaissance siege warfare was the mine, and not mine in the romantic buried treasure sense, but mine in the "we're going to dig a tunnel under your wall and then collapse" its sense. Ottoman engineers were among the best in the world at this technique. The process worked like this. You dig a tunnel under the enemy's fortifications, prop up the tunnel with wooden supports, pack the supports with combustible material, and then set it on fire. The tunnel collapses, and with sufficient luck and engineering, the wall above it collapses with it, opening a breach that your infantry can pour through. The defenders of Eger knew this was coming. Counter-mining was the response. Dig your own tunnels to intercept the enemy's tunnels, and then fight them underground in the dark, in narrow passages barely wide enough for 2 men, with short swords and torches, while the world above continued to try to kill you in its own ways simultaneously. Mining was not a fast process. It required careful planning, skilled labour, and a reasonable geological understanding of what lay beneath the ground between the siege lines and the castle wall. The Ottoman engineers would have surveyed the terrain before committing to a mining operation, identifying sections of ground where the soil was soft enough to dig quickly, but stable enough not to collapse prematurely on the miners themselves. which was a professional hazard of the trade that everyone in the business was aware of. The digging teams worked in shifts, like the defenders above them, moving dirt and stone back through the tunnel in baskets, while the excavation at the front crept forward, metre by metre toward the base of the wall. Inside the castle, the detection of an enemy mine was its own specialised skill, the classic technique, one that was used at Eger and has been documented in sieges across centuries, involved placing bowls or drums of water or stretched parchment on the ground near the walls and watching them. If the surface below was being excavated, the vibration of the digging would transmit through the ground and cause the surface of the water to ripple or the parchment to hum almost inaudibly. It was primitive seismic detection, but it worked, and it was one of the things that Bornemissa and the castle's engineers were specifically watching for throughout the siege. When a mining operation was detected, the response was to begin countermining, digging your own tunnel from inside the castle to intersect the enemy's tunnel before it reached the wall. This is where the underground war happened. Two teams of men digging toward each other through the dark, each hoping to break through into the other's tunnel before the other did the same to them. When the tunnels connected, the fighting that followed was conducted in conditions that tested human psychology in ways that open-field combat did not. You were underground, in the dark, in a space barely wide enough to swing a short sword, and the man trying to kill you was close enough that you could hear him breathing before you could see him. The Ottoman mining operations at Eger achieved some successes. In at least one instance, a mine was detonated beneath a section of wall, causing a collapse that briefly opened a path for assault. The defenders sealed it. They'd been repairing breaches for weeks by that point, and had developed a grim efficiency at it. The underground war, like the war above ground, was a grinding, exhausting contest of persistence, and the defenders of Eger refused to concede it. Even underground, in the worst possible conditions, they held their position, which, when you consider what those conditions actually were, is a remarkable thing to say. By the second week of the siege, the question of morale is not an abstract leadership concern, it is the most concrete military resource inside those walls, more valuable than food, more essential than ammunition. Because you can have all the supplies in the world, but if the men stop believing the walls can hold, the walls stop holding. Dobó understood this the way a good coach understands the team, not as a sentimental notion, but as a practical reality that required active management every single day. He was visible. He walked the walls. He ate the same food as the common soldiers. He appeared at every crisis point, not always because the crisis required his specific military expertise, but because his presence said something that no speech could say as efficiently. I am still here, which means we are still here, which means this is still possible. That visible calm in a leader, in a genuinely catastrophic situation, is one of the most powerful forces in human group psychology, and Dobó wielded it like a weapon. Human psychology under sustained threat follows patterns that military commanders have observed and tried to work with for as long as there have been military commanders. The initial response to danger is acute, adrenaline, focus, heightened awareness, a temporary suppression of the kind of long-term thinking that would otherwise produce despair. This acute response is useful in the first hours and days of a crisis. It is not sustainable for 5 weeks. What replaces it, if the leadership is doing its job, is something quieter and more durable, a kind of deliberate conscious commitment that the person renews not once, in a dramatic moment, but every morning in the ordinary act of getting up and going back to the wall. The defenders of Eger were not uniformly brave in the way that legends tend to require their heroes to be. They were human beings in an extreme situation, and human beings in extreme situations experience fear, doubt, anger, grief, and the persistent, seductive fantasy of being somewhere else. What distinguished the garrison of Eger was not the absence of those feelings, but the collective decision, maintained across 5 weeks and 2,000 people, to act in spite of them. That decision did not maintain itself. It had to be cultivated, reinforced, and sometimes forcibly restored, and Dobó was the primary engine of that cultivation. Religion played a role that modern accounts sometimes underemphasize. The 16th century was not an era of secular stoicism. The defenders of Eger were people of deep faith, and the defence of the castle was understood by many of them in explicitly religious terms. They were Christian soldiers defending a Christian stronghold against an Ottoman advance that represented, in the religious imagination of the era, an existential threat to their faith and civilization. This framing gave the suffering of the siege a meaning that purely military logic could not provide. Suffering in a meaningful cause is psychologically different from suffering for nothing, and the defenders of Eger had a very clear sense of what they were suffering for. By the 3rd week, the garrison had survived long enough to develop something that the 1st week had not yet produced: the specific confidence of people who have been tested and have not broken. Every assault repelled, every breach sealed, every morning when the walls were still there added to an accumulating evidence base that said, quietly and persistently, we can do this, not forever, but long enough. And long enough, it turned out, was exactly what they needed. There are moments in the Siege of Eger when the Ottomans come very, very close. The 4th of October is one of those days, a massive coordinated assault on multiple sections of the wall simultaneously, designed to stretch the defending force past its breaking point. It nearly works. In several places, Ottoman soldiers reach the top of the walls. In at least one location, they get over them. What follows is not clean military history. It is the chaotic, desperate, intimate violence of men fighting in very small spaces with whatever is at hand, because when the choice is kill or watch the fortress fall, the mind simplifies its options considerably. Dobó himself is wounded in this fighting. It does not slow him down, or if it does, he does not let anyone see it slowing him down, which is functionally the same thing. The breach is sealed, the assault is repelled, and the Ottomans pull back to reorganize, which they do, because this is a professional army and professional armies always reorganize. The 4th of October assault was not a spontaneous decision. It was the product of weeks of observation, bombardment, and engineering work. The Ottomans had been systematically identifying the weaker sections of the wall and concentrating their fire on them, and by October they had succeeded in creating multiple points where the defensive integrity was compromised enough to attempt a coordinated breach. The assault was launched on several fronts at once, specifically because a multi-point attack forces the defenders to divide their limited numbers among multiple crises simultaneously, and a garrison of 2,000 people defending a perimeter of hundreds of meters has very limited capacity to do that. The fighting on the 4th of October was the closest the Ottomans came to success. Assault ladders went up against the walls in multiple locations. The janissaries, the elite infantry who led the assault, were disciplined, experienced, and well equipped, and they did not panic under fire in the way that less trained soldiers might. They took their casualties and kept climbing, because they had been trained to take casualties and keep climbing, and the number of them available to climb was substantially larger than the number of defenders available to push them back off. In the sections where the Ottomans crested the wall, what followed was the kind of fighting that the defenders had been training for in the 3 years before the siege, and dreading in the 5 weeks since it began: close combat on a narrow battlement, with no room to manoeuvre, no time to reload, and the consequence of failure visible on all sides. The defenders used swords, spears, axes, and their own bodies, pushing back against men who had just climbed a wall under fire and were not in a yielding mood. Women were in this fighting. Boys were in this fighting. Everyone who could hold something with a sharp edge was in this fighting, because the wall was the only thing between the inside and the outside, and the inside was not surrendering. The Ottomans pulled back before nightfall. The assault had cost them heavily in men and had produced no permanent breach. The defenders had held, but at a cost of their own that they could not easily absorb. The garrison was smaller after the 4th of October than it had been before, and the wall sections that had been most severely tested were in worse condition than before the assault. What the garrison gained was something else, the knowledge that even the worst the Ottomans could deliver had not been enough. They were still there, the walls were still there, and the Ottoman army, for all its size and power, had not gotten through. That knowledge was its own kind of ammunition, and they spent it carefully for the days that remained. Let us talk about the tools of the trade, because the defenders of Eger Castle were fighting with a surprisingly varied arsenal, and not all of it was conventional. There were cannons, fewer than the Ottomans and smaller, but the defenders had the advantage of fixed positions and pre-targeted ranges, which meant their shots were considerably more accurate than incoming fire from a moving siege line. There were arquebuses, the matchlock firearms of the period, heavy, slow to reload, requiring a lit match and favourable weather, but capable of killing at distances that a crossbow could not reliably reach. There were crossbows, which were quieter and faster to load than the arquebus, and still entirely capable of ruining your day at medium range. There were swords, spears and halberds for the close fighting, and then there were the improvised solutions, the boiling water, the burning ash, the rocks, the quicklime, substances that, when applied to a human being from above, made the argument for staying off the walls very compellingly. The arquebus was the firearm of the period, and understanding what it was like to use one is important for understanding why the crossbow was still relevant. An arquebus was a long-barreled, smooth-bore firearm that fired a lead ball using a matchlock mechanism. A slow-burning rope match was held in a clamp, and pulling the trigger brought the lit match into contact with a pan of gunpowder, igniting the charge and firing the ball. This process required the match to be lit and actively burning at the moment of firing, which meant that in wet weather, or wind, or situations where maintaining a lit match was difficult, the arquebus became temporarily useless. It also required a significant reload time. A trained soldier could manage perhaps 2 shots per minute in good conditions, which in the middle of an active assault was a very long time between shots. But when it worked at ranges well beyond what a bow could reliably achieve, and the psychological impact of firearms on troops who were not accustomed to them was an additional, non-trivial effect. The crossbow complemented the arquebus precisely because it did not share its weaknesses. It did not care about rain. It did not require a burning match. It could be loaded and held ready indefinitely without degradation. A skilled crossbowman could achieve a reasonable rate of accurate fire that, at the ranges typical of castle defence, was entirely sufficient to make assault unpleasant. The two weapons together gave the defenders a layered ranged capability: crossbows for reliability and rate of fire, arquebuses for range and stopping power, that multiplied their effective firepower beyond what either weapon alone would have provided. The castle's cannons, though smaller than the Ottoman siege guns, served a specific and important function. They were not trying to match the Ottoman artillery in a counter-battery exchange. That was a fight the garrison could not win. They were positioned to cover the approaches to the walls, the areas through which an assault force would have to move to reach the base. A cannon firing into massed troops in an open approach causes casualties, and more importantly, disruption. Men who are being fired on from the flanks do not advance in orderly formation, and disorganized troops climbing ladders against a defended wall are considerably less dangerous than organized ones. The castle's guns were essentially a tool for making the Ottomans' approach to the walls as expensive as possible, and in this role they performed their function throughout the siege with the grim efficiency of weapons that know exactly what they are for. The improvised weapons, the boiling water, the burning material, the stones, require no sophisticated analysis. They were effective because gravity is non-negotiable, and physics does not care how many soldiers you have. A large stone dropped from a height onto a man below is a problem for that man that no amount of training resolves. They were available, they were simple, and they worked. Sometimes the oldest solutions are old because nothing better has been invented yet. Dobó could not have done this alone, and he knew it. The defence of Eger was a collective effort, and the names of his lieutenants deserve their moment, because they made decisions and took personal risks that history sometimes bundles into the word garrison when they should be individual stories. István Mekce was Dobó's second in command, another Hungarian nobleman who had chosen to stand when standing was the unreasonable option. Gergely Bornemisza was a military engineer, arguably the most tactically creative person inside those walls, whose contributions to the defence went well beyond what military engineering was traditionally expected to provide. These men managed sections of the wall, organised the countermining operations, led sorties against Ottoman positions, and did all of this while also managing the morale and discipline of 2,000 exhausted, frightened people who were looking to them for the kind of confidence that, internally, must have been running a bit thin by week 3. Mekce's role was, in many ways, the role that does not make it into the stories, the essential, unglamorous work of keeping the machine running while someone else makes the decisions that get remembered. He managed sections of the wall, he coordinated the watch rotations, he ensured that the logistics of the defence, ammunition distribution, repair crews, food allocation, were functioning in the background without requiring Dobó's direct attention at every moment. This kind of operational management is invisible until it fails, and at Eger it did not fail, which means Mekce did his job well enough that nobody noticed how much depended on him doing it. That is either the definition of excellent staff work or an injustice of history, and it is probably both. The officer corps of the garrison also included lesser-known figures whose names appear in the historical record primarily in connection with specific incidents: a man who held a particular section of wall during a critical assault, a gunner who achieved a notable shot against an Ottoman artillery position, a cavalry officer who led a sortie outside the walls to disrupt a mining operation. These are the people who filled the space between the major named figures and the anonymous garrison, and they were essential. A defence of this duration and complexity does not function on the strength of 2 or 3 exceptional individuals. It functions because a sufficient number of people at every level of the hierarchy are doing their jobs competently under conditions that make competence extremely difficult to maintain. The relationship between Dobó and his officers was necessarily close in the physical sense. They were all inside the same castle, eating the same food, sleeping the same broken hours, experiencing the same bombardment. In modern military structures, distance between ranks is often maintained deliberately, but in a besieged castle in the 16th century, that distance collapsed of its own accord. Dobó knew his officers personally, in the way that people who have survived something together know each other, not just professionally, but as individuals with their specific strengths and weaknesses, their particular forms of courage and their particular limits. This personal knowledge was a tactical resource. When a section of wall needed a steady officer who would not panic under the heaviest fire, Dobó knew which of his men that was. When a delicate negotiation with a frightened group of garrison soldiers needed someone with the right combination of authority and human warmth, he knew who to send. The allocation of people to situations in a crisis is a form of leadership that requires exactly this kind of knowledge, and Dobó had it. The team held because the team had been built to hold by a man who understood that walls are only as strong as the people standing on top of them. Gergely Bornemisza requires his own segment, because what he did at Eger is the kind of thing that makes military historians pause, set down their coffee, and say out loud to no one in particular, he did what? Bornemisza was a military engineer, which in the 16th century meant a man who understood both construction and destruction at a level that others found simultaneously impressive and slightly alarming. At Eger, facing an Ottoman army with greater numbers, greater firepower, and a significantly larger budget, Bornemissza developed weapons that were, by the standards of 1552, genuinely avant-garde. He constructed large-wheeled frames packed with combustible material that could be set alight and rolled down toward massed Ottoman formations. He built a device that scattered burning material over a wide area. He designed projectiles that were essentially primitive incendiary bombs, lobbed over the walls to create chaos among attackers. None of these things were standard. All of them worked. The most famous of Bornemisza's innovations was a device that historians have described in various ways, but which amounted to a large barrel or container filled with a mixture of combustible and pyrotechnic materials, sulphur, tar, gunpowder, and other substances, which was designed to be ignited and either rolled or launched toward massed enemy troops. The effect on impact was not a clean explosion in the modern sense, but a spreading fire that adhered to surfaces and to people, and which could not be easily extinguished. In an era before any form of fire suppression equipment beyond water and sand, a burning substance that stuck to you and kept burning was one of the most effective anti-personnel tools available, and Bornemissza had essentially invented a 16th century version of it from materials available inside a besieged castle. This is the kind of engineering that emerges when a genuinely creative mind is placed under extreme constraint and told to solve a problem with whatever is at hand. He also developed what the historical sources describe as wheeled fire vehicles, large frames mounted on wheels, packed with combustible material that could be ignited and rolled down slopes toward Ottoman formations below the walls. The vision of this is almost cartoonish. A massive burning wheel careening toward a massed assault formation, but the effect was entirely serious. Fire moves through tightly packed groups of men in ways that other weapons do not, and a formation that is dealing with an unexpected rolling inferno is not a formation that is maintaining its assault discipline. Disruption, even temporary disruption, at the critical moment of an assault could mean the difference between a breach being held and a breach being lost. What made Bornemisza's contributions distinctive was not just the ingenuity of the weapons themselves, but the understanding behind them. He was thinking about the problem of defending a small garrison against a large army not in terms of matching the enemy's strength, which was impossible, but in terms of multiplying the cost the enemy paid for every metre of ground they gained. Every assault that was broken up by fire, every mining operation disrupted by a countermine, every massed formation scattered by an unexpected weapon, was an assault that cost the Ottomans more than they had calculated. Accumulate enough of those excess costs, and the calculation changes. The siege becomes too expensive, and that, in the end, is exactly what happened. Bornemissza survived the siege. He is one of the people whose name the historical record has preserved, which is a small justice in a story that contains many unnamed contributors. His weapons were not battlefield-changing in the grand strategic sense, but inside those walls, in those weeks, they were exactly what the defence needed at the moments it needed them most. At various points during the siege, the Ottomans attempted to negotiate because even the most powerful army in the world prefers a cheap victory to an expensive one, and Eger was becoming expensive. Envoys were sent with offers, surrender now, and the garrison would be allowed to leave with their lives. The terms were not unreasonable by the brutal standards of 16th century siege warfare. This was the Ottoman Empire extending what they considered to be a genuine courtesy, based on the entirely reasonable expectation that 2,000 people facing 100,000 would eventually have an honest conversation with arithmetic. Dobó's responses to these overtures were not lengthy. He was not rude about it. He was a diplomat as well as a soldier, but he was extremely clear. The castle was not surrendering. The garrison was staying. And if the Ottomans would like to continue discussing the matter, they were welcome to keep trying, but the walls would tell them the answer in more physical terms than he could. Surrender negotiations during a siege followed a fairly well understood protocol in the 16th century, and understanding that protocol clarifies why Dobó's refusals were not simply acts of suicidal pride. The terms offered to a garrison depended heavily on when in the siege the surrender happened. A garrison that surrendered before the walls were seriously breached could generally negotiate honourable terms, safe passage, retention of personal property, the right to march out with weapons. A garrison that held until the walls were breached and then surrendered could expect significantly worse terms, and a garrison that continued fighting after a breach, forcing the attackers to take the fortification by storm, could expect no mercy at all, because the laws of war as understood in this period held that a commander who refused reasonable surrender terms and then lost had forfeited his garrison's right to quarter. This calculus was not lost on Dobó. He was not refusing to negotiate because he was unaware of the risks. He was refusing because he had made a calculation about the larger strategic situation that went beyond the immediate survival of his garrison. Every day that Eger held was a day that the Ottoman campaign in Hungary was delayed. Every day of delay was a day that winter came closer. Every day of delay was a day that the Habsburg administration had more time to respond, or failed to respond, which at least clarified the situation. The defence of Eger was not primarily about saving the lives of 2,000 people, though that mattered. It was about the cost imposed on an Ottoman advance that, if unchecked, would continue north and west into the heart of what remained of Free Hungary. Dobó understood this because he was not just a soldier, he was a political actor in a complex regional situation, and he had thought carefully about what the defence of Eger meant in that broader context. He also understood something about the psychology of siege warfare that the Ottoman commanders may have underestimated. A garrison that has refused to surrender once is harder to convince to surrender the second time. Every refusal built on the previous one, creating a momentum of resistance that became its own kind of force. By the third week, Dobó was not simply saying no to a new offer. He was saying no to the accumulated weight of every previous offer, and the garrison behind him had watched him say no every time, and they had kept fighting, and the walls were still standing, and the offers were still being refused, and somehow, impossibly, that was still true. It is easy, when reading the Siege of Eger from the Hungarian side, to think of the Ottoman army as a monolithic force of pure threat, which it was, from the inside of the castle walls. But out in the siege lines things were also complicated. Kara Ahmed Pasha had not expected this. His army had other targets on its agenda, a broader campaign in Hungary that the Siege of Eger was delaying, day after day, at significant cost in men, ammunition, and the thing that armies hate to spend more than either of those: time. The approach of autumn in Central Europe was not a neutral factor. The days were shortening. The temperature was dropping. An army of 100,000 men in tents on an exposed plain consumed supplies at a rate that would stagger most modern logistics managers, and every day that Eger held was another day of that consumption, with nothing to show for it but a castle that had refused to collapse on schedule. Kara Ahmed Pasha was an experienced military commander who had overseen successful campaigns before Eger and would oversee successful ones after it. He was not a man who made obvious errors of planning or execution. The failure at Eger was not, from the Ottoman perspective, a failure of military competence. It was an encounter with a defensive resistance that exceeded any reasonable projection based on the available information. You look at a fortress of this size defended by this many men, and you make a calculation. The calculation at Eger was wrong, not because the calculation was badly done, but because the inputs were wrong. The inputs assumed a level of resistance that 2,000 people defending a second-tier Hungarian fortress against the full might of the Ottoman Empire were not supposed to produce. The inputs were wrong because Dobó was not a typical garrison commander, and because the defenders of Eger were not typical defenders, and because sometimes the variables you cannot quantify are the ones that decide the outcome. The Ottoman camp itself was a logistical challenge that grew more pressing with each passing day. Feeding, watering, and maintaining a force of 100,000 men in the field required a supply chain that stretched back across hundreds of kilometres of Hungarian territory. Fodder for the horses and oxen, grain for the men, wood for the fires, all of it had to move forward continuously along roads that were not designed for this volume of traffic, and were deteriorating under it. The further the campaign extended into autumn, the harder this became. Mud slows wagons, cold kills horses, sick men cannot fight. The Ottoman army was not immune to these pressures, it was subject to them in proportion to its size, which meant it was subject to them enormously. Inside the Ottoman command tent, the conversations in early October must have been increasingly uncomfortable. The siege was in its 4th week. The walls were damaged but holding. The garrison showed no sign of breaking. The casualty count from repeated assaults was mounting. The supplies were being consumed. The weather was deteriorating. And somewhere, in the back of every senior Ottoman officer's mind, was the awareness that this siege was supposed to be a step in a larger campaign, and that larger campaign was now completely stalled because 2,000 Hungarians had refused to accept the conclusion that arithmetic demanded of them. The decision to withdraw on the 17th of October was not a defeat in the grand strategic sense of that word, but it was the outcome that nobody in that camp had seriously planned for when they arrived in September. That gap between expectation and reality is, in military terms, the definition of a significant surprise. Among the defenders of Eger were people who had no business being on a castle wall in a battle, and who were there anyway, because in a siege the concept of non-combatant becomes philosophically difficult to maintain when the walls are coming down. There were boys in the garrison, not boys in a casual metaphorical sense, but actual teenage boys who served as runners, ammunition carriers, and assistants to the gunners. In a fortress under active bombardment, these were not safe jobs. Running across an open courtyard with powder and shot during a sustained artillery barrage was a task that required speed, awareness, and a relationship with danger that most people today would consider entirely unacceptable for someone who's not yet finished growing. And yet they did it. They did it every day for more than a month, because the men at the cannons needed ammunition, and someone had to bring it, and there they were. The use of boys in military support roles was not unusual in the 16th century, and understanding that context neither excuses nor diminishes it, it simply explains it. The world of 1552 did not have the same concept of childhood as a protected developmental period that modern societies have constructed. Boys became men in the practical sense of taking on adult responsibilities at ages that modern people would find shocking. A boy of 14 or 15 in this era might already have years of physically demanding labour behind him, might be legally capable of military service, and would certainly have been considered an able-bodied contributor to a collective defence effort in which everyone capable of contributing was expected to do so. Inside Eger Castle, the boys serving as runners and ammunition carriers occupied a role that was structurally essential. The distance between the ammunition storage areas and the gun positions was not trivial in a castle of this size, with ammunition stored in protected interior spaces and the cannons positioned on exposed outer walls. Carrying a load of powder and shot from storage to gun could mean crossing open ground that was under fire. Adult soldiers were needed at their posts. You could not pull an artilleryman away from his cannon every time it needed reloading, without degrading the castle's firepower in direct proportion to the frequency of resupply. Boys who were not yet strong enough to haul a cannon, or skilled enough to fire one, were entirely capable of running a route quickly and repeatedly, and that capability was used. what they experienced in those 5 weeks, the noise, the fear, the physical danger, the deaths of people they knew around them, left marks that the historical record does not preserve in individual detail, but that we can reconstruct from the general nature of the experience. You do not spend 5 weeks as a teenager inside a besieged castle, carrying ammunition past cannon impacts and emerge unchanged by it. The survivors of Eger carried that autumn with them for the rest of their lives, and the boys who served in it carried it as their first adult memory, the specific, irreversible knowledge of what human beings are capable of, both in the direction of destruction and in the direction of stubborn collective endurance. They held the castle too, not with swords, not with cannons, with their legs and their speed, and their willingness to keep running when running was the frightening thing to do. History does not always remember the people who carried the ammunition, but the cannons could not have fired without them, and the cannons were part of what held the walls, and the walls were what held Eger. The chain goes all the way down to the boys who ran. The nights at Eger during the siege had their own particular texture, different from the days in ways that went beyond the darkness. During the day, the bombardment was the organising principle of every moment. You were either repairing damage, fighting off an assault, or bracing for the next one. But at night the cannon fire usually slowed or stopped, not from mercy, but from practicality. Siege artillery was difficult to aim in the dark, and the Ottomans were not in the business of wasting expensive ammunition on invisible walls. In that relative quiet, the fortress did not relax so much as it breathed differently. Men came off the walls, ate, tended to wounds, and slept in the heavy, dreamless way that only genuine physical exhaustion produces. The watch rotations continued. Dobó was not the kind of commander who left the walls unobserved on the theory that nothing happened at night, but the energy inside the castle shifted from acute crisis to the slower, grinding effort of people who have decided to survive and are doing the maintenance work that surviving requires. The night watch was a specific and unglamorous assignment. You stood on the wall in the dark in the cold of a central, European autumn that was deepening week by week, and you listened. Not for cannon fire that you would hear regardless of whether you were listening for it. You listened for the sounds that did not belong. The scrape of a ladder being positioned against the base of the wall, the muffled movement of men in the siege lines changing positions, the particular silence that precedes a night assault, which is its own kind of sound, a held breath quality to the air that experienced soldiers learn to recognize the way you learn to recognize the specific silence before a storm. Your job was to hear these things before they became crises, and to raise the alarm in time for the crisis to be met, rather than merely survived. The psychological experience of the night watch at Eger was shaped by the particular quality of darkness in a pre-industrial landscape. There was no ambient light beyond the fires in the Ottoman camp, which were visible from the walls as a constellation of orange points stretched across the valley floor. On a clear night, those fires were almost beautiful, a reminder of the enormous human presence camped outside the walls. Yes, but also simply light in the darkness, and light has a way of being beautiful regardless of what it represents. On overcast nights, the darkness was more complete, and the sounds from the siege lines carried differently, farther, more distorted, harder to interpret correctly. The men on the night watch talked, quietly, in the way that people talk when they are standing together in the dark and have nothing to do but wait. These conversations were not recorded anywhere. They happened between people whose names history mostly did not preserve, in a language that has changed substantially in the 5 centuries since, about things that exhausted people on a castle wall at 2 a.m. talk about: home, food, what they would do when this was over, whether this would be over. The particular gallows humour that soldiers in, difficult situations have always produced because making something funny is one of the ways human beings assert control over things that are otherwise entirely beyond their control. Dobó made his own rounds at night. Not every night, but regularly enough that the men on the watch knew he might appear at any post at any hour, which is itself a management technique. The awareness that the commander might be watching is a mild but consistent motivator for maintaining standards even in the cold and dark when no one seems to be paying attention. He would stop, speak briefly, move on. His presence in the night was a reminder that the castle did not sleep, even when its people did, and that the vigil was shared from the top of the command structure all the way down to the youngest boy on his first watch rotation. The night passed, as nights do, and in the morning the walls were still there, the 17th of October, 1552, 38 days after the siege began. On this day, Kara Ahmed Pasha ordered the Ottoman army to withdraw. No breach had been successfully held. No gate had been forced. The garrison was battered, exhausted, and significantly reduced in number, but it was still inside the walls, still functioning, still fighting. And the Ottoman commander, standing at the end of 5 weeks of failure in front of the most stubborn 2,000 people in Central Europe, made the decision that commanders make when the cost-benefit calculation stops making sense. He ordered the tents taken down, the artillery limbered up, and the army moved away. The defenders of Eger watched from the walls. It is reported that there was cheering. Given what these people had just survived, that seems like something of an understatement. The withdrawal of the Ottoman army was not instantaneous. Moving 100,000 men and their equipment is not like closing a laptop and walking away. It was a process that took time, and the defenders watching from the walls would have seen it unfold over hours. The systematic dismantling of the camp, the long columns of men and oxen and wagons beginning to move away from the castle, the siege lines that had defined the horizons of their world for 5 weeks, gradually thinning and then disappearing. There must have been a moment, somewhere in that process, when it became undeniable that the army was actually leaving and not simply repositioning for another assault. That moment must have felt extraordinary. The human response to the end of a sustained crisis is not always what we expect it to be. The dramatic cheering and celebration is real, the historical sources mention it, but alongside it there was almost certainly something quieter and stranger. The particular disorientation of people who have organised their entire existence around a single urgent task and suddenly find that task over. For 38 days, the question of whether you would be alive tomorrow had been the organising principle of every decision, every action, every conservation of energy. When that question was removed, the space it left behind was not immediately filled with joy. It was filled at first with a kind of stunned vacancy, the psychological equivalent of standing in a room where a very loud noise has just stopped, waiting for your nervous system to accept that the quiet is real. The cost of the defence was visible everywhere inside those walls. The garrison had begun the siege at roughly 2,100 people. By the 17th of October, a significant number of those people were dead, and more were wounded in ways that would take weeks or months to heal, if they healed at all. The walls that Dobó had spent 3 years building and improving were damaged throughout their length, some sections barely standing. The supplies that had been carefully prepositioned were largely consumed. The castle that the garrison had defended was not the same castle they'd started with. It was a surviving castle, which is different, scarred, depleted, but upright. Dobó reportedly ordered prayers of thanksgiving before anything else. This was not a performance of piety, it was a genuine expression of something that everyone inside those walls felt in their own way. The almost incomprehensible fact that they had been there at the beginning, and they were still there at the end, and the end had been the right kind. They had done the impossible thing. The math had said they should not be alive. They were alive anyway. Sometimes that is the whole story, and it is enough. The Siege of Eger in 1552 did not end the Ottoman threat to Hungary. The Ottomans would return. They came back in 1687, and that time they succeeded, holding Eger for nearly a century before the Habsburgs retook it. History is not a story with a simple ending. But what Eger's defence in 1552 did was something that military victories cannot always claim. It changed the story. It demonstrated to Hungary, to the Ottoman Empire, and to the watching courts of Europe that the Ottoman advance was not automatic. It could be stopped. 2,000 people with walls, determination, and the collective decision that they were not moving had held off the best army in the world for 38 days and sent it home. That was new information. And new information about what is possible has a way of echoing forward through time in ways that are difficult to fully measure. The immediate strategic consequences were significant. The Ottoman campaign in Hungary in 1552 had been aimed at extending Ottoman control northward and westward, threatening the Habsburg territories and potentially striking toward Vienna for a second time. Eger's resistance consumed 5 weeks of campaign season that the Ottomans had not budgeted for, delayed their advance, and ultimately contributed to the campaign failing to achieve its objectives for that year. The army that withdrew from Eger in October didn't immediately pivot to another target. The season was too far gone, the men were tired, the supplies were depleted. The campaign ended without the dramatic gains it had been designed to produce. For Hungary, the effect was different and deeper than simple strategic calculation. Hungary in 1552 was a country that had been losing for 26 years, losing territory, losing population, losing the sense that resistance was possible rather than merely noble and futile. Mohács had established a narrative of inevitability about the Ottoman advance, a story in which the outcome was predetermined and the only variable was how long the inevitable took to arrive. Eger broke that narrative. Not permanently, not completely, the Ottomans would eventually take Eger, as they eventually took most of what they set out to take, but in the specific, psychologically crucial sense that it demonstrated the narrative was not inevitable. The ending could be different. Under the right conditions, with the right people, the right preparation, and the right collective will, the answer could be no. That demonstration had effects that extended well beyond 1552. It became a reference point, a proof of concept, a piece of evidence that Hungarians could point to and say, this is what is possible. This is what we are capable of. In the long history of a nation that would spend much of the following centuries under foreign domination, Ottoman, Habsburg, Soviet, the memory of Eger functioned as a kind of persistent reminder that domination was never the complete truth about Hungary, that resistance was always part of the story too. Dobó survived the siege and was recognised for his achievement. He was celebrated, promoted and given additional responsibilities in the defence of the Hungarian frontier, which was both a recognition of his abilities and a somewhat darkly humorous acknowledgement that the frontier still needed defending. He died in 1572, 20 years after the siege, which, given what he had survived in the autumn of 1552, seems like an almost improbably peaceful outcome for a man who had spent a month and a half being shot at by an empire. He had earned it. The historical siege was remarkable. But the Siege of Eger, as most Hungarians know it, as a foundational national story, as something taught to children, as a cultural touchstone, owes much of its particular shape to a novelist named Géza Gardonyi, who published a book in 1899 called Eclipse of the Crescent Moon, known in Hungarian as Egri Csillagok, or Stars of Eger. Gardonyi took the historical record, added fictional characters, and crafted a narrative that turned the siege into something that was simultaneously accurate in its broad strokes and deeply, deliberately emotional in its particulars. The book became one of the most beloved novels in Hungarian literature, the kind of book that Hungarian children read in school the way English children might read a Shakespeare play, or American children might read a Steinbeck novel, not just as a story, but as an encounter with something the culture considers essentially itself. Gardoni was writing at a specific historical moment, the end of the 19th century, when Hungary was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Hungarian national identity was a subject of intense cultural and political energy. The dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary had been established in 1867, giving Hungary significant internal autonomy, but the question of what Hungarian identity meant and what it was rooted in was alive and contested. The historical novel was one of the tools that 19th century national cultures used to answer that question, by telling stories about the past that explained the present and justified the future. Gardoni chose Eger as his subject because it was the story that contained, in compressed form, the argument he wanted to make about what Hungary was, a nation that had faced the worst and refused to break, that had held its ground when holding its ground made no rational sense, that had transformed stubbornness into a form of grace. The novel follows a fictional young Hungarian protagonist named Gergo Bornemisza, a deliberate echo of the real historical engineer Gergely Bornemisza from his childhood through his experiences during the siege. This narrative structure allowed Gardoni to show the siege through the eyes of someone who was not yet formed when it began, and was irrevocably formed by it by the end, which is the shape of a coming-of-age story mapped onto a historical event. It was a shrewd choice because it gave readers of any era an entry point into the material through a character whose relationship to the events was one of discovery rather than expertise. The reader and the protagonist learned about the siege together, which created the particular kind of intimacy that historical fiction achieves when it is working well. The accuracy of the novel's historical content was, for its era, remarkable. Gardoni had done serious research. The details of the siege, the weapons, the fortifications, the key figures, the timeline, these were drawn from genuine historical sources and were largely correct in their essentials. The invented elements, the protagonist, the romantic storylines, some of the dialogue, were layered onto this accurate foundation rather than substituting for it. The result was a book that felt true in the way that good historical fiction feels true. Not because every detail is documented, but because the emotional and human reality it depicts is consistent with what the documentary record suggests about the experience of being inside those walls. Generations of Hungarian children have read this book and carried its version of Eger with them into adulthood. It is the reason the siege is remembered not just as a historical event, but as a story, with characters, with emotional stakes, with the specific weight that fiction gives to events that would otherwise remain abstractions in a textbook. Gardoni gave Eger its face, and Hungary has been looking at it ever since. The castle at Eger still stands. This is worth stating plainly because it is easy to assume that a place that has been fought over repeatedly, besieged, occupied, and rebuilt over 500 years might not have much of its original fabric left, and in some technical architectural respects that is true. But the walls are there, the towers are there, and the museum inside the castle tells the story of 1552 with the particular intensity of a place that genuinely means it, not as a tourist attraction performing history for visitors, but as a community that has been carrying this story for nearly 5 centuries and has not yet decided to put it down. In the town below, you can visit the minaret that the Ottomans built during their later occupation, which stands in the middle of a very Hungarian street like a footnote that refused to be erased. And on a clear day from the castle walls, you can look out over the valley and try to imagine the fires. You will underestimate. They always do. The castle today is a museum and a park, which sounds like the ending that history gives to places that have been domesticated by time, turned into something safe and educational, and slightly removed from the original intensity of what happened there, and there is some truth to that. The walls that once held back an empire now hold back school groups on day trips, which is a significant de-escalation. The towers that once housed desperate gunners now house archaeological displays. The ground where Ottoman assault formations massed now has a pleasant walking path, and, on summer weekends, people eating lunch in the sun. History has been converted into heritage, which is what happens when enough time passes, but something of the original thing persists. It persists in the Dobó István Museum, the castle museum named for the defender himself, where the artifacts of the siege are displayed with a care that suggests the people curating them understand what they are handling. Cannonballs recovered from the site, weapons from the period, documents, maps, the physical residue of the autumn of 1552, preserved in glass cases and offered to anyone who wants to look closely enough. There is a statue of Dobó in the main square of Eger, a large commanding bronze figure, sword raised, facing south in the direction from which the Ottoman army came. He's been standing there since 1907, facing the same direction he faced in 1552, which is the kind of symbolic continuity that a culture maintains when it has decided that a particular story belongs at the centre of its identity. The minaret is the Ottoman contribution to Eger's skyline, a slender tower in the Turkish style, 39 metres tall, built during the period of Ottoman occupation between 1687 and 1702. It is the northernmost surviving Ottoman minaret in Europe, and it stands a few minutes' walk from the castle in the middle of the old town, surrounded by Baroque Hungarian architecture that was built after the Ottomans left. It is a strange and beautiful thing, a piece of one civilization inserted into the body of another, preserved not out of hostility or nostalgia, but out of the simple recognition that it is there, and it is old, and it is part of the story of this place, even the complicated parts. Standing on the walls of Eger Castle today, looking out over the valley, you are standing where the defenders of 1552 stood. The valley is the same valley. The hills are the same hills. The sky above them is the same sky under which Dobó walked his rounds in the cold October darkness, and the women of Eger carried stones to the battlements, and the boys ran powder through the courtyard, and 2,000 people made the daily, unremarkable, extraordinary decision to remain. The grass has grown back over everything the siege disturbed, but the walls remember. Stone is patient that way, and if you're quiet enough standing up there in the late afternoon when the tour groups have gone home and the light is going gold over the valley, you can almost feel the weight of what happened here, the sheer, stubborn, magnificent refusal of it. 2,000 people, 150,000 reasons to leave, 38 days, and then the army went home instead. Good night. Let's talk about the price, because every story of heroic resistance has a number attached to it that the celebratory version tends to glide past, and that number deserves to be looked at directly. The defenders of Eger did not emerge from 38 days of siege without loss. Men died on those walls, not in the abstract collective way that military casualty. Figures suggest, but one by one, in specific moments, in specific places, leaving specific gaps in the garrison that the people standing next to them felt immediately and personally. The historical record does not preserve the name of every defender who died at Eger in the autumn of 1552, and that silence is its own kind of loss. But the aggregate cost was real, and understanding it is part of understanding what the defence actually was, not a clean triumph, but a survival purchased at genuine human expense, by people who knew the price going in and paid it anyway. The garrison began the siege at roughly 2,100 people. By the time the Ottoman army withdrew on the 17th of October, estimates suggest that somewhere between 300 and 400 defenders had been killed, with a significant additional number wounded, some likely enough to return to the walls within days, others severely enough that they would spend weeks or months recovering if they recovered at all. In a garrison of 2,000, Losing 300 or 400 people over 38 days means losing roughly 1 in 5. In a force that was already stretched thin across a perimeter it could barely cover, that attrition had consequences that were felt in real time, at every watch rotation, every time a section of wall needed more men than were available to defend it. The dead were buried inside the castle during the siege, because there was nowhere else for them to go. The ground within the castle walls became, over those 38 days, both a home and a graveyard simultaneously, and the defenders lived and fought within sight of where their comrades had been put in the earth. This is the kind of experience that does not have a modern equivalent for most people, the sustained proximity to death, not as an abstract risk, but as a visible, daily, accumulating reality. You knew the men who were buried there. You had eaten with them, stood watch with them, repaired walls beside them, and then they were gone, and the wall still needed defending, and you went back to it. The wounded presented their own challenge. The castle's medical resources were, as we've established, limited, a captured surgeon's chest, whatever herbal knowledge the garrison possessed, and the grim practical skills of men who had learned battlefield medicine by necessity rather than training. Wounds that would be survivable with modern care were frequently fatal in 1552, not from the initial injury but from the infection that followed it. A sword cut that missed every vital structure could still kill a man 2 weeks later, via a fever that climbed steadily until it could not be brought down. The garrison's wounded were a drain on resources. They needed food, water, and care that the able-bodied defenders were also competing for, and they were a constant visible reminder of what the siege was costing, and yet the garrison held, not despite the losses, but in some complicated way, partly because of them, because every man who died on those walls made the decision to leave feel more like a betrayal of something real and irreversible. You do not abandon a position that your friends died defending. That is not a rational calculation. It is something older and more binding than rationality. The specific human loyalty to the people who are already gone, the refusal to make their deaths meaningless by walking away from what they died for. The dead of Eger held the castle as surely as the living did, maybe more. Here is something that modern retellings of the Siege of Eger sometimes underemphasize, because we live in an era that tends to treat religion as a private matter, a military history as a secular one. The defenders of Eger Castle were people of deep, active, daily faith, and that faith was not background decoration to the defence. It was structural. The 16th century in Central Europe was not a time of casual, religious identity. The Reformation was tearing Western Christianity apart at the seams. The Ottoman advance was understood in explicitly religious terms by everyone it threatened, and the men and women inside Eger Castle prayed with the specific, non-metaphorical conviction of people who believed that the outcome of the next assault was a matter in which God had a direct and personal interest. Whether you share that conviction or not, its effect on the people who held it was entirely real, and it shaped the psychology of the defence in ways that purely military analysis cannot capture. The cathedral inside Eger Castle had been converted for military use before the siege began, its structure repurposed to serve the practical needs of the defence rather than its original liturgical function. But this did not mean that religious practice stopped. It continued in the spaces available to it, in the informal prayers of individuals on the walls, in the collective prayers that the garrison conducted before major assaults, in the specific personal negotiations with the divine that people in extreme situations have always conducted, regardless of whether a formal religious space is available. You didn't need a cathedral to pray in Eger in October of 1552. You needed 30 seconds and a wall to lean against, and both of those were available in quantity. The framing of the defence in religious terms was not incidental. It was one of the primary ways that Dobó and his officers gave the suffering of the siege a meaning that pure military logic could not provide on its own. They were not simply defending a castle, they were defending Christendom. They were the wall between the Ottoman advance and the heart of Christian Europe, and every day they held was a day that walls stood. This framing was historically accurate in a geopolitical sense. The Ottoman campaign in Hungary was genuinely understood by both sides as a conflict between civilizations and faiths, but it also functioned as a psychological resource of enormous value. Suffering in a meaningful cause is bearable in ways that arbitrary suffering is not, and the garrison of Eger had a very clear, very large, very non-arbitrary cause to attach their suffering to. It also shaped how the defenders understood the outcome when it came. When the Ottoman army withdrew on the 17th of October, the first thing Dobó ordered was prayer of thanksgiving. This was not a formality. It was the natural expression of a worldview in which the defence of Eger had been, from the beginning, understood as something larger than a military engagement, a test, a trial, a moment in which something beyond human capability had been required and had somehow been provided. Whether that something was divine intervention, collective human will, extraordinary individual courage, or simply the accumulated weight of 3 years of careful preparation, the garrison experienced it as grace, and they gave thanks for it accordingly, on their knees, in the damaged castle that was still standing, in the quiet that followed 38 days of noise. We have spent the better part of this script inside the walls of Eger Castle, which is where the dramatic centre of this story lives. But on the other side of those walls for 38 days, there were also human beings, Ottoman soldiers, janissaries, engineers, cavalry, and the vast supporting apparatus of the Empire's military machine, who were experiencing the siege from a perspective that history has preserved in considerably less detail, and which deserves at least a few minutes of honest attention. Because the Ottoman soldiers who died in the assaults on Eger's walls were not abstractions. They were men who had marched a long way from home, who had their own families and their own fears and their own reasons for being there, and who died in very large numbers against walls that refused to fall. Their story is the other half of the siege, and it is a story that the triumphant Hungarian version of events tends to leave in the shadows. Ottoman casualty figures for the Siege of Eger are disputed and difficult to verify, as casualty figures from this period generally are, but the estimates range from several thousand to as many as 10,000 Ottoman soldiers killed or seriously wounded over the course of the 38-day siege. Even at the lower end of that range, the human cost on the attacking side was staggering, far higher in absolute numbers than the losses suffered by the garrison. This is the arithmetic of assault against a defended fortification. The attacker pays a premium in blood for every metre of ground gained, and when the fortification does not fall, the premium has been paid for nothing. The janissaries who led the major assaults were elite soldiers, trained from childhood for exactly this kind of combat. They were also human beings who watched their comrades die in very large numbers over the course of 5 weeks in repeated assaults against walls that should have fallen and did not. The psychological effect of sustained failure on a force that was accustomed to success is not a simple matter of morale declining. It is more complicated than that, involving the specific disorientation of men whose professional identity was built on the expectation of victory, encountering a situation that refused to produce one. The janissaries did not break. They kept assaulting, kept dying, kept regrouping. That persistence was its own form of extraordinary human endurance. It simply met something more extraordinary on the other side of the wall. The ordinary soldiers of the Ottoman army, the irregular infantry, the cavalry, the support troops, experienced the siege as a long, cold, expensive wait, punctuated by episodes of intense and costly violence. They were far from home. They were consuming supplies at a rate that the campaign had not fully accounted for. They were watching the autumn deepen around them and feeling the specific anxiety of soldiers who understand that weather is an enemy that does not negotiate. They were human beings in a difficult situation, on the wrong side of a wall that would not give way, and when the order finally came to withdraw on the 17th of October, it is not unreasonable to imagine that many of them felt something not entirely unlike relief. The Siege of Eger cost the Ottoman Empire enormously, in lives, in treasure, in time, and in the specific currency of military reputation. The men who paid that cost were not symbols, they were people, and they deserve at least a sentence that says so. Let's zoom out for a moment, because the Siege of Eger did not happen in isolation, and understanding what it meant requires understanding the larger world it happened inside, a world that was, in the autumn of 1552, in a state of sustained, exhausting, multi-sided conflict that had been running for decades and would continue for decades more. Hungary in this period was not simply a country being invaded, it was a contested space in a geopolitical competition between two empires, the Ottoman Empire expanding northwest from Constantinople, and the Habsburg Empire extending southeast from Vienna, with what remained of independent Hungarian political authority caught between them, trying to navigate a situation in which both of the major powers nominally claiming to be its protectors were also, in their different ways, a threat to its independence. This is the world that produced Eger, and the siege makes more sense when you can see the shape of it. The Habsburgs, the Austrian dynasty that had acquired the Hungarian crown after Mohács, were Hungary's nominal protectors, and in 1552 they were conspicuously absent from the defence of Eger in a way that Dobó and his garrison were acutely aware of throughout the siege. The Habsburg Emperor Charles V was, at this moment in history, dealing with a European situation of considerable complexity. The ongoing conflict with France, the Protestant Reformation fracturing the Holy Roman Empire, and a dozen other crises competing for his attention and resources. Hungary was important to the Habsburgs, but it was not, in the autumn of 1552, the only important thing. The reinforcements that Dobó had requested before the siege began did not arrive. The relief army that might have forced the Ottomans to divide their attention never materialized. Eger was defended without Habsburg help, which is both a fact of military history and a piece of political information that shaped Hungarian attitudes toward Habsburg authority for generations afterward. The Ottoman campaign of 1552 was itself part of a longer pattern of Ottoman expansion that had been reshaping the political map of Central Europe for more than a generation. The Ottomans were not simply raiding, they were administering, taxing, and governing the territories they controlled, building mosques and markets and administrative structures in formerly Hungarian cities. The Ottoman-controlled central plains of Hungary were, by 1552, beginning to develop the character of a permanent Ottoman province rather than a temporary occupation. This permanence was what made the defence of the northern Hungarian fortresses, Eger among them, strategically critical. If those fortresses fell, there was no natural defensive line between the Ottoman-held plains and the Habsburg heartland of Austria. Eger was not just a Hungarian problem, it was a European one. The chain of fortresses along the northern Hungarian frontier, of which Eger was one of the most important, was the primary tool through which Habsburg Hungary tried to contain the Ottoman advance. These fortresses were garrisoned, supplied and maintained at enormous expense, and they were staffed by a mixture of Hungarian nobles, professional soldiers, and mercenaries who understood that their job was to make Ottoman expansion as costly as possible. Dobó was part of this system, appointed by Habsburg authority, supplied by Habsburg resources, fighting in a conflict that was ultimately about the contest between two empires. But inside those walls, in the autumn of 1552, the political complexity of the larger situation was irrelevant. What mattered was simpler and more immediate: the wall, the garrison, and the army outside. Everything else was context. The defence of Eger was the content. History has a way of organising itself around the most prominent figures, the commanders, the nobles, the people whose names were already attached to documents and decisions before the extraordinary event that makes them remembered. Dobó is the name most people associate with Eger, as he should be, but the historical record of the 1552 siege has preserved other names too, people who were not the captain, who did not command the garrison, who held no titles that would have guaranteed their survival in the archives, but whose specific acts were remarkable enough that someone wrote them down. These are the lesser-known defenders of Eger, and spending a few minutes with them is not just a matter of historical completeness. It is a reminder that extraordinary collective efforts are always made up of individual extraordinary moments, most of which go unrecorded, and the ones that were recorded are worth the time it takes to say them out loud. Gergely Bornemissa we have already met, the engineer whose improvised weapons changed the mathematics of several critical assaults. But there were others. Among the cavalry officers who distinguished themselves during the siege was a man named Christoph Vass, who led sorties outside the walls against Ottoman positions on multiple occasions, a form of active defence that required a very specific combination of courage and tactical judgment, since a sortie that went wrong outside the walls could not be rescued from inside them. Sorties were high-risk operations conducted with small groups of men, aimed at disrupting Ottoman siege work, destroying mining equipment, or simply imposing costs on an enemy who expected to conduct his siege operations without interference from the people he was besieging. Vass conducted these operations repeatedly, which tells you something about the kind of man he was. Among the gunners whose skill contributed materially to the defence were men whose names the record has not fully preserved, but whose achievements were noted. The accuracy of the castle's artillery against Ottoman positions was remarked upon by contemporaneous sources, and accuracy of that kind did not happen by accident. It was the product of trained men who knew their guns, knew their ranges, and maintained their focus and precision under conditions that made focus and precision genuinely difficult to maintain. Every Ottoman gun crew disrupted by accurate return fire was a crew that was not adding to the bombardment of the walls, and every assault formation scattered by well-aimed cannon fire was an assault that cost more than it should have. The gunners of Eger held a critical part of the defence, and they held it with skill. The women whose names the record preserved, Cecilia Varkotzi among them, fought alongside their husbands and brothers and fathers with a matter-of-factness that suggests they understood themselves to be defenders of the same thing the men were defending, and saw no particular reason why that should not include them. The historical sources do not treat their participation as remarkable, which is in its own way remarkable, not because women fighting in sieges was common, but because in Eger, in 1552, it apparently felt natural enough to the people experiencing it that the accounts simply note it as a fact rather than pausing to express surprise. That matter-of-factness is a small, telling detail about the nature of the community inside those walls, a community under sufficient pressure that the usual categories had dissolved, and what remained was simply people defending their home. These are the other heroes of Eger, not the ones the statues are built for, not the ones whose names are on the museum walls in the largest letters, the ones who held their section of wall on the worst days, who carried the ammunition when the courtyard was being hit, who stood watch in the cold at 3 a.m. and did not leave their post. Their names are mostly gone, but the walls they defended are still standing, and that is its own kind of monument, one they built together, held together, and left standing for the rest of us to find. And so, tonight, we leave the walls of Eger Castle standing in the cold October air of 1552, as they have been standing, in one form or another, for nearly 500 years since. Think about what those 2,000 people actually did. They woke up every morning for 38 days, looked out over a valley filled with the largest army they had ever seen or ever would see, and made the same decision. Not once, in a blaze of dramatic inspiration, but 38 times, in the ordinary, unglamorous, half-asleep way that real courage actually works. They repaired the walls that kept getting knocked down. They carried the ammunition across the courtyard that kept getting hit. They stood on the night watch in the cold when nothing was happening and the temptation to be somewhere else was the loudest thing in the world. They held on, not because it was easy, but because they had decided together, quietly, without ceremony, that this was the thing they were going to do. The women who poured boiling water from the battlements never asked to be soldiers. The boys who ran powder to the guns never asked to grow up that fast. The men who dug counter-tunnels in the dark in narrow passages underground, fighting by torchlight against people they could hear before they could see, none of them signed up for exactly that. They signed up for a garrison posting in a mid-sized Hungarian fortress. They got something considerably more than that, and they rose to it, in the specific, unrepeatable, collective way that human beings sometimes rise to things that should be beyond them. So tonight, as you pull your blanket a little tighter and feel the particular luxury of a bed that is not a straw pallet on a stone floor in a castle under active bombardment, maybe take a quiet moment to appreciate what you have. Hot water, walls that are not currently being hit by cannon fire, the reasonable expectation that you will wake up tomorrow in the same place you fell asleep. These are not small things. They are the things that the defenders of Eger Castle were fighting for, not in abstract political terms, but in the most immediate and personal sense. The right to be here tomorrow, the right to have a home that is still standing in the morning. History is full of people who did impossible things in impossible circumstances and left the world different for having done them. Most of their names are gone. Most of what they experience has not been preserved in any form that lets us feel its full weight. But sometimes, in a place like Eger, enough survived. The walls, the records, the novels, the wine with the extraordinary name, that the story comes through with something of its original force intact. And when it does, it says something that all the great stories of human endurance say, in one way or another. That people are more than the circumstances they are handed. That the math is not always the final word. That 2,000 stubborn, frightened, faithful, exhausted human beings can look at 150,000 reasons to give up and find, somewhere in themselves, one reason not to. The castle is still there. The valley is still there. The wine is still there if you ever find yourself in a small town in northern Hungary on a clear autumn afternoon with a reason to raise a glass, and now the walls are holding, the watch has been kept, and the army has gone home. It is time to sleep. Good night.